January 1943. The jungle air of Guadalcanal hangs thick with rot and gunpowder. A Japanese patrol moves cautiously through what was once an American position. A chaotic sprawl of burnt foxholes, shattered helmets, and the acrid scent of cordite clinging to the leaves. The battle has ended, but its ghosts remain. Among the wreckage, a soldier spots something half buried in the mud. A rifle heavier and stranger than any he's held before. Its metal gleams beneath the grime, its wooden stock cut with precision unlike the rough edges of their own Arisakas. He lifts it, feels the balance, the unfamiliar weight. There's no bolt to work, no manual reload, just a mechanical rhythm waiting to be unleashed. He squeezes the trigger and hears a metallic click, smooth, tight, engineered. Around him, his comrades gather, whispering. None have seen a weapon like this. They know it's American, but it feels ahead of them, beyond them. That rifle will soon cross the Pacific again, not in battle, but in crates marked captured ordnance. It will arrive in Tokyo, placed on a white table under the lights of the Army Technical Bureau, and there Japan's finest engineers will begin to understand what they are truly up against. In the years leading up to the Second World War, every major power believed it understood what defined a modern rifle. For half a century, the bolt-action rifle had ruled the battlefield, a soldier's rhythm dictated by the slow lift, pull, and push of steel. Britain's Lee Enfield, Germany's Mauser 98, and Japan's own Arisaka rifles represented that philosophy. Simplicity, durability, and discipline. Fire was controlled by training, not by technology. Accuracy mattered more than speed. A soldier's marksmanship, not his weapons mechanism, was the pride of an army. But across the Pacific, the United States was quietly rewriting that rule.
In 1936, the U.S. Army approved a new standard service rifle, the M1 Garand.
It was not just another rifle. It was a declaration of industrial ambition. John C. Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory, had designed a gas-operated semi-automatic weapon capable of firing 8 rounds in rapid succession without manual cycling. It combined precision with speed, the kind of innovation no other army dared to mass produce. When the first units reached American troops in 1937, few outside the United States paid attention. To the rest of the world, it seemed unnecessary, excessive even. The old guard saw it as wasteful in both cost and ammunition, but war has a way of punishing those who underestimate progress. By 1941, when Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor, nearly every U.S. infantryman carried an M1 Garand. They entered combat with a rifle that could deliver twice, sometimes 3 times, the volume of fire of their enemies. Each trigger pull was a burst of steel and sound that didn't require reloading after every shot. The metallic ping of its empty clip ejecting became an unmistakable signature on battlefields from the Philippines to North Africa. To the Japanese, who prized discipline and individual accuracy, this rapid-fire weapon seemed crude at first, a noisy tool for untrained hands. But soon reports from the front began to tell a different story. Japanese soldiers in the Philippines described American firepower as continuous and unrelenting. Entire squads could lay down suppressive fire without pause, pinning down defenders before they could even reload. The Arisaka rifles, though finely built, were slow and methodical. They could not compete with the tempo of American infantry assault tactics. What the Japanese did not yet realize was that this difference went beyond marksmanship, and it reflected a divide in philosophy and industry itself. Japan's small arms development was guided by practicality and resource constraints. The Type 38 and Type 99 Arisakas were rugged, easy to produce, and dependable in the mud and heat of Asia. They fired with precision and were built to last, but they were relics of a 19th century design lineage. A design born in an era when warfare moved slower and armies fought line by line. The M1 Garand, by contrast, was a weapon born of the assembly line, designed for the industrial battlefield of the 20th century. It symbolized an America that could afford to equip millions of men with cutting-edge technology, where engineering replaced ritual and production replaced patience. When American forces landed in the Solomon Islands in 1942, the first true encounters between the M1 Garand and the Arisaka began. At Guadalcanal, the humid air carried the sharp rhythm of semi-automatic fire. Japanese soldiers reported that American rifles fired like machine guns, a phrase repeated in field communications. At first, commanders dismissed it as exaggeration, until the captured weapons began arriving at collection points. The first Garands reached Japanese ordnance officers through recovered battlefield caches, rifles taken from fallen Marines or seized in ambushes. Engineers in the field were ordered to preserve and ship them back to Tokyo for inspection. Inside military circles, the arrival of these captured rifles was met with curiosity, even skepticism. Could a nation really issue such a complex weapon to every soldier? To Japanese weapons designers, who were accustomed to limited resources and traditional craftsmanship, the Garand represented something almost alien, a machine not designed for the artisan but for the factory. And as those crates made their long journey across the sea, a quiet anticipation built among Japan's engineers. They would soon discover that this weapon did not merely redefine the rifle, it redefined what kind of nation could build one. When the first captured M1 Garands arrived in Japan, the war had already shifted against the Imperial Army's favor. It was late 1942, and the once unstoppable expansion across the Pacific had begun to slow. Supply routes were strained, industry was overworked, and Japan's scientific community was fighting an invisible war against shortages of steel, copper, and fuel. Yet in the quiet workshops of the Army Technical Bureau in Tokyo, a different kind of battle was unfolding. One fought not with rifles and bayonets, but with calipers, blueprints, and open minds. The crates from Guadalcanal were opened carefully, each rifle lifted from straw padding like an artifact. The men in white coats and oil-stained gloves examined them in silence. Their first impressions were disbelief. The Garand's machining was immaculate. Edges smooth, tolerances impossibly tight for a weapon built by the tens of thousands. Its operating rod curved elegantly along the right side, connected to a gas cylinder near the muzzle. Every motion of the bolt was fluid, precise. The finish gleamed with a kind of industrial confidence that Japanese craftsmen rarely saw outside of aircraft parts. They disassembled the rifle, part by part, laying each component on the table. The gas-operated semi-automatic mechanism drew immediate attention. It harnessed the energy of the fired cartridge to eject the spent casing and chamber a new round, all in one motion. To Japanese engineers accustomed to bolt-action simplicity, it seemed both ingenious and risky, a marvel of mechanical timing that required metals and machining of the highest quality. Any flaw, any roughness would break the cycle, but here nothing failed. Even after exposure to the humid Pacific, the weapon's function remained smooth. Reports soon circulated within ordnance circles. The Garand could deliver up to 40 aimed shots per minute, double what an Arisaka rifleman could achieve. Its gas system, developed after years of trial and error by John Garand, used a long-stroke piston that balanced reliability with manageable recoil. The 8-round en-bloc clip allowed quick reloads, ejecting with a sharp metallic ping that became legendary among American troops. Japanese officers noted the weapon's psychological effect as well. That rhythmic firing, so fast and relentless, often made defenders believe they were facing automatic weapons. As engineers wrote their evaluations, a quiet respect began to replace disbelief. This rifle, one report noted, represents a complete understanding of modern battle requirements. The M1 Garand embodied everything Japan's war industry could not yet achieve, not for lack of skill, but for lack of capacity. Its creation required advanced metallurgy, mass production consistency, and an industrial culture that could produce identical precision across hundreds of thousands of units. In Japan, each rifle still bore traces of the craftsman's hand. In America, uniform perfection was the standard. What fascinated the Japanese analysts most was not the design itself, but what it revealed about the enemy. The Garand was more than a weapon. It was proof of an entire nation's industrial philosophy. It showed that the United States viewed war not as an art of individual valor, but as a system of efficiency, repeatability, and overwhelming production. It reflected a belief that technology could compensate for distance, terrain, and even training. That belief was now firing across the Pacific, one trigger pull at a time. By 1943, as American forces advanced island by island, the Garand's presence became impossible to ignore. Japanese field reports increasingly mentioned its devastating impact. Defenders on New Georgia and Bougainville described battles where American riflemen fired with a tempo no bolt-action unit could match. "They do not stop," one lieutenant wrote in a field note recovered after the war. "Their rifles sound like many guns from one man." Such experiences echoed what the engineers in Tokyo already knew. This was not a weapon Japan could replicate quickly, nor one it could counter with existing tactics. Still, the Army's technical division began limited experimentation. Could they design a Japanese semi-automatic rifle inspired by the Garand? Early prototypes appeared, cumbersome, unreliable, and quickly abandoned. The problem was not intellect but infrastructure. The precision machining, the heat-treated steels, the interchangeable parts, all required a manufacturing ecosystem Japan did not possess in wartime conditions. The Garand was the product of a nation whose factories, not artisans, won wars. The engineers' final reports carried a tone of reluctant admiration. "The American rifle is decades ahead of our time," one summary concluded. It was not a confession of defeat but a recognition of inevitability, that the nature of warfare had changed. The rifle in their hands was not just an enemy weapon. It was a glimpse into the future, and that realization, more than any bullet or battle, would shape how Japan understood the coming years of war, and the industrial struggle it could never fully win. In Tokyo's weapon laboratories, the M1 Garand became more than an object of study. It became a mirror. The engineers, machinists, and officers who examined it saw in its precision not just clever design, but an entirely different way of thinking about war. The first angle they explored was purely mechanical, the realm of science and engineering. They studied the Garand's gas system with the same intensity one might reserve for an aircraft engine. It was a closed cycle of pressure and motion, perfectly balanced, self-regulating, elegant in its simplicity. The expanding gases from a fired round were redirected through a small port near the muzzle, driving a piston that cycled the bolt. This process transformed recoil into motion, waste into power. What fascinated them most was that it worked under battlefield conditions, through mud, heat, and corrosion. To replicate such a mechanism, Japan would need both the precision of its gunsmiths and the volume of American industry. The weapon's metallurgy alone was astonishing. Heat-treated receivers, resilient springs, and machined tolerances that held even after tens of thousands of rounds. It was as if the rifle itself had been designed with the industrial soul of a nation in mind, a weapon built not by men, but by machines serving a larger idea. For Japanese designers accustomed to hand-fitting each rifle's bolt and barrel, the Garand was a revelation. It showed that true strength came not from complexity, but from repeatable perfection. Every part, from the firing pin to the gas cylinder, could be replaced with another from a different factory without losing accuracy. That kind of interchangeability was revolutionary. It meant that America could field and repair weapons anywhere in the world, and everyone would function the same. It was a concept Japan admired but could not match, not when its industries were fragmented and constrained by scarce raw materials. The tactical angle revealed an even deeper truth. On the battlefield, the Garand's semi-automatic fire changed the rhythm of combat itself. American squads no longer needed to rely on machine guns to maintain suppressive fire. Every infantryman became a source of rapid, continuous attack. The sound of battle had changed. Gone was the steady crack of bolt-action rifles, replaced by the rolling thunder of overlapping semi-automatic fire. Japanese officers described their confusion during early encounters, mistaking rifle fire for that of automatic weapons. It wasn't just the speed, it was the consistency. The Americans fired faster, reloaded quicker, and maintained accuracy under pressure. Tactically, this altered everything. Japanese infantry doctrine, rooted in aggression and close combat, was built around closing the distance swiftly, the bayonet charge as both weapon and philosophy. But against the Garand, that tradition met its breaking point. The weapon's sustained firepower made open assaults suicidal. Advancing troops were cut down before they could even reach grenade range. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and later Saipan, countless field reports documented failed charges where American riflemen stopped entire platoons before they reached the perimeter wire. The Garand gave the U.S. soldier not just more bullets but more control over time, more seconds to respond, more chances to survive. Behind this advantage was doctrine. The United States had long believed in individual firepower, in the ability of each man to influence the outcome of a fight. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, emphasized cohesion and sacrifice. The Garand blurred that line. It gave every soldier the lethality of 2 or 3, amplifying his presence in battle. When combined with superior logistics, endless ammunition, constant supply, the rifle's design became a strategic weapon in itself. It was not just a tool in war, but a statement of how America fought, efficiently, relentlessly, and without pause. As the engineers' reports deepened, the tone shifted from admiration to anxiety. The weapon's mechanical perfection was impressive enough, but what it revealed about the mindset behind it was far more alarming. America had mechanized the art of killing. The M1 Garand was not a rare masterpiece to be cherished. It was a product, one that could be made, replaced, and shipped by the millions. Japan's weapon makers realized they were facing a civilization that treated war as an industry, not a ritual. That understanding cut deep, because it exposed the unbridgeable gap between two philosophies, one driven by spirit and craft, the other by scale and innovation. The engineers set down their pens knowing they were not just examining a rifle. They were looking at the machine that symbolized their opponent's entire way of war. The psychological impact of the M1 Garand reached far beyond its steel and wood. For the men who examined it in Tokyo, it became a silent teacher, one that challenged everything they had been taught about superiority, discipline, and the role of human will in warfare. In Japanese military culture, the soldier was the weapon. His courage, obedience, and readiness to die were the true measures of strength. The rifle, by contrast, was merely an extension of that spirit. But the Garand shattered that belief. Here was a weapon that made even an average soldier terrifyingly efficient. It leveled the field between experience and youth, between training and instinct. It was as though America had decided that technology could amplify courage, that innovation itself could become a force of morale. Japanese officers and engineers found this unsettling. Their reports, recovered after the war, reveal not just technical admiration, but a kind of existential discomfort. They saw in the Garand the embodiment of a society that believed machines could overcome man's limits. The American fights with confidence in his weapon, one Japanese evaluation read, while we fight with faith in our cause. That line captured the essence of Japan's psychological dilemma. The enemy's strength was not just material, it was mental. American soldiers trusted their weapons to deliver. They didn't need to summon courage every time they fired. The rifle itself carried part of that burden. Within the Japanese high command, these findings sparked quiet debate. Could Japan produce something comparable? Not merely a rifle, but the industrial system required to sustain it? The answer, known but rarely spoken, was no. Japan's weapon industry was fragmented among small subcontractors, each producing parts by hand or with minimal automation. The Garand, by contrast, was born in vast factories where thousands of workers built precision components under tight tolerances, each one identical to the last. The difference was not in genius, it was in scale, and scale in total war was destiny. From a strategic and industrial perspective, the M1 Garand was a symptom of something larger, America's transformation of war into a system. Every aspect of its design fit into an ecosystem of production lines, supply chains, and logistics networks that stretched across oceans. It wasn't just that the U.S. could produce better weapons. It could produce them endlessly. A Japanese factory could make 1,000 rifles in a month. An American factory could make 10,000, all with the same precision. That imbalance haunted Japan's planners far more than the rifle's rate of fire ever could. Even so, the engineers couldn't help but respect what they saw. The Garand's balance of simplicity and sophistication reminded them of their own ideals, harmony between man and machine. But this harmony had evolved. The Americans had stripped the weapon of ornament, of tradition, of any trace of personal craftsmanship. It was pure function. Every curve, every spring, every mechanism existed for one reason: to fire again, faster than before. In that stripped-down efficiency, Japan's analysts saw the reflection of a culture utterly confident in its machines. There was also a moral angle, though few dared to write about it openly. Some among the technical corps began to question what such efficiency meant for the future of war. If technology could multiply destruction so easily, where did honor fit in? The Garand made killing impersonal, distant, rapid, industrial. It was no longer a duel between warriors but between production lines. And yet this was the reality the modern world demanded. The rifle's existence was proof that humanity was entering an era where wars would no longer be won by valor, but by voltage, by steel, by the rhythm of assembly machines working day and night. For Japan, steeped in the code of Bushido and the sanctity of sacrifice, this realization was profound. The M1 Garand had done what no weapon before it could. It made them doubt their future, not because it fired faster, but because it showed them what they could not yet become. And on battlefields across the Pacific, that truth was already echoing, in the sound of 8 rapid shots, and the metallic ping that marked the beginning of a new age of warfare. In the spring of 1944, deep inside the laboratories of Japan's Army Technical Bureau, a small team of engineers worked through the night. They were surrounded by sketches, micrometers, and the stripped skeletons of captured rifles. Their goal was audacious: to design a Japanese semi-automatic rifle that could stand beside the M1 Garand. The war outside was going badly. The Empire's perimeter was shrinking, its supply lines collapsing. But inside that room, pride and desperation fused into one final effort to catch up with the enemy's technological leap. They began with the Type 5, a weapon inspired directly by the Garand's gas-operated mechanism. The design team studied how the M1 harnessed recoil energy through its gas port, how it managed pressure and cycling without jamming. They adapted these principles into their prototype, replacing the Garand's end block clip with a 10-round internal magazine loaded by standard Arisakas stripper clips. On paper, it seemed promising. In practice, it revealed the limits of Japan's wartime industry. The machining lacked the precision needed for such a delicate system. Gas pistons leaked under pressure, springs lost tension too quickly, and the rifle's components warped after repeated firing. Each one had to be hand-fitted, defeating the purpose of a standardized design. Only a few dozen prototypes were ever produced, most never leaving the testing range. Yet to the engineers, the experiment was revealing, a technical confession written in steel. The problem was not knowledge, but infrastructure. They understood how the Garand worked. They simply could not reproduce it consistently. Meanwhile, on the front lines, American troops were demonstrating what mass production and innovation truly meant in combat. On Saipan in June 1944, U.S. Marines advanced through cane fields under withering Japanese fire. The Garands barked in rhythmic unison, short bursts, steady, almost mechanical. Each Marine fired as if part of a living machine. Japanese soldiers, armed mostly with bolt-action rifles, could barely return effective fire before waves of bullets forced them down. Machine guns were scarce, ammunition even scarcer. In those moments, the engineers' reports in Tokyo became prophecy. The Garand wasn't just an advantage, it was dominance made visible. Captured Japanese officers later described their shock at the tempo of American infantry fire. It was as if every man was a light machine gun, one said during interrogation after the war. The Arisaka, a fine rifle for deliberate shooting, was helpless against that kind of sustained pressure. Soldiers trained to fire with calm precision found themselves overwhelmed before they could even take proper aim. The old rhythm of war, advance, aim, fire, reload, was gone. The Garand had turned battle into a continuous pulse of action. Inside the Imperial Army Command, discussions grew tense. Some officers dismissed the rifle's importance, arguing that superior spirit and tactics could still prevail. Others quietly disagreed. They had read the technical reports, seen the captured rifles, and knew the truth. The M1 Garand was not just a tool, but a symptom of America's entire war machine. Japan could not match the industrial pace behind it. Even if they produced their own semi-automatic rifle, they could never produce enough. The issue was not invention, it was multiplication. By late 1944, Japan's technical divisions were facing collapse. Air raids disrupted transport. Factories lacked materials, and the quality of steel deteriorated under shortages. The Type 5 project was quietly abandoned, its prototypes locked away as curiosities. The engineers who had once admired the Garand's precision now watched their own machines grind to a halt. What they had learned was too late to matter. Yet in the ruins of their efforts something lingered and respect. Respect for a weapon that had redefined modern infantry combat. Respect for the engineer, John Garand, whose design foresight had outpaced the world. And respect for the truth that no amount of courage or sacrifice could replace a nation's ability to innovate. The engineers didn't know it then, but their study of the M1 Garand would survive the war, influencing Japan's future designs long after the empire fell. But in 1944, all they could see was the shadow of their enemy's superiority growing longer with each defeat. The Garand had done more than win battles. It had exposed the fragile limits of Japan's war dream. And as the war dragged into its final year, those limits would become impossible to ignore, echoing from the laboratories of Tokyo to the blood-soaked sands of Iwo Jima. ChatGPT said, by early 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of illusions. The Imperial Japanese Army still fought with determination, but its spirit was being drowned beneath the mechanical rhythm of American firepower. The M1 Garand, once an object of curiosity in Japanese laboratories, was now the weapon every surviving soldier feared. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, the reality of its power could no longer be denied. When the first waves of U.S. Marines landed that February, they carried rifles that gleamed under the volcanic haze, rifles that had already earned a reputation as extensions of their owner's will. The Marines advanced in pairs, firing and moving, their Garands cracking with precision and speed. Japanese defenders, hidden in tunnels and pillboxes, watched in disbelief as entire squads fired without pause. The sound was relentless, echoing across the beach like rolling thunder. The Garand's 8-round rhythm was so steady that it seemed automatic, a symphony of engineering turned lethal efficiency. Survivors of those battles described the experience as being under a rain of bullets. The traditional Japanese counterattacks, once fierce and sudden, were shredded before they could form. Bayonet charges dissolved under waves of semi-automatic fire. Platoons that once relied on the courage of their men now found that courage meaningless in the face of mechanical inevitability. The M1 Garand gave the Americans control over time itself. They could fire, reload, and fire again before the enemy's bolt had even cycled once. For Japanese officers, this weapon had become a symbol of humiliation and inevitability. Reports from the field grew somber. "Our men fight bravely," one colonel wrote from Okinawa, "but their courage cannot stop the rain." He meant the Garands, the endless metallic rhythm that followed every advance, every defense. American squads used the weapon not just for killing but for dominance, constant suppressive psychological pressure. The sound of a Garand was no longer just a gunshot. It was the heartbeat of an empire that could build faster, fight longer, and sustain more. The Japanese command understood now that the war was no longer about skill or valor. It was about production. Every Garand that fired in the Pacific was the final product of factories in Massachusetts, Illinois, and Connecticut, humming assembly lines that worked without rest. Behind each Marine or infantryman stood an entire continent of labor, steel, and science. Japan's small workshops could not compete with that kind of momentum. The difference between the M1 Garand and the Arisaka was no longer mechanical. It was civilizational. One belonged to a world that had embraced modernity completely. The other clung to an age where the craftsman's hand still ruled the forge. On Okinawa, the last desperate charges of Japanese infantry showed the tragic gap between belief and reality. Hundreds of men charged into machine gun and rifle fire, their Arisakas clutched tight, bayonets gleaming in the sun. But before they reached even 50 yards, most were already down. The Garand's reports came in rapid succession. 8 shots, reload, 8 more. Seamless, mechanical, merciless. By the time silence returned, there was nothing left but smoke and the metallic clatter of spent clips on stone. In post-war interrogations, Japanese engineers admitted what many officers already knew by 1944. The M1 Garand had been a generation ahead. "We could not build it," one former ordnance officer said plainly. "Not then. Not with what we had." That admission carried the weight of something deeper, a recognition that the war had not been lost solely on the battlefield, but in the foundries, laboratories, and drafting tables long before the first shot was fired. The Garand was not simply a rifle. It was a doctrine forged in metal, the belief that precision, repetition, and industry could replace the uncertainty of human will. And for Japan, that doctrine proved impossible to counter. The Arisaka may have embodied the spirit of the warrior, but the Garand embodied the future of war. As the empire crumbled and the Pacific burned, the Japanese engineers who once studied that rifle could only watch history move beyond them. The M1 Garand had started as a captured curiosity on a muddy battlefield. It ended as the weapon that defined the industrial victory of one nation and the irreversible decline of another. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan lay in silence. Cities that had once glowed with ambition now smoldered under the weight of surrender. The engineers who had examined the M1 Garand in those pristine laboratories returned to homes reduced to ash. Their blueprints were gone, their factories dismantled, their purpose erased. Yet the image of that rifle, its smooth cycling, its flawless precision, lingered in their minds. American soldiers marched through the ruins carrying the same weapon that had broken the empire's resistance. In the hands of occupation forces, the Garand was no longer a tool of war, but a symbol of dominance, a reminder of how far the world had shifted. The Japanese people, once taught to believe in spiritual superiority, now faced the undeniable truth of technological supremacy. In the months that followed, captured rifles and disassembled components were studied one final time, not as enemy artifacts, but as blueprints for a new beginning. Young engineers from the remnants of the imperial workshops found themselves working under American supervision, learning the principles of mass production and interchangeability that had once seemed alien. From those lessons, Japan's post-war industrial miracle would slowly emerge. The Garand's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. In every sense, it had rewritten the philosophy of modern warfare, that speed, reliability, and repeatability could conquer even the fiercest human spirit. Where once the samurai ideal had guided Japanese weapon design, now the American principle of mechanical efficiency became the new creed. In America, the rifle achieved near-mythic status. General George S. Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and for millions of returning soldiers it became a symbol of the nation's ingenuity. The Garand represented not just victory in war but mastery over the machine, the transformation of human effort into industrial rhythm. By contrast, in Japan, it became a ghost of defeat. Engineers remembered its impossible precision. Soldiers recalled its unending fire. And as decades passed, the weapon came to embody the moment Japan realized that valor alone could not win a modern war. In archives across Tokyo, a few surviving photographs show that first captured rifle, the one unearthed from the mud of Guadalcanal. It sits on a table surrounded by notebooks filled with sketches and measurements, a silent witness to a nation's reckoning. Those who handled it then could not have imagined how completely it would reshape their world, because in the end, the Garand was more than steel and wood. It was a message written in the language of progress, that the future belongs not to the strongest, but to those who can build faster, think broader, and adapt sooner. Japan learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and in that understanding, the seeds of its rebirth were sown. By 1946, the war's wreckage was being swept away, not just from cities, but from the minds of those who had fought it. Inside a small engineering hall in Tokyo, now repurposed by the Allied Occupation Authority, a group of former military technicians gathered under fluorescent light. Among them were men who had once measured every curve of the M1 Garand. Now, they worked with civilian contracts, rebuilding rail systems, repairing machine tools, helping restart Japan's industries from zero. Yet each time they handled steel, the memory of that rifle's flawless machining returned. The M1 had revealed something deeper than American firepower. It had shown the essence of modern warfare, synchronization. Every trigger pull, every ejected clip, every replaced part represented a harmony between man and machine. Japan's pre-war production methods, based on craftsmanship and limited runs, could never have achieved this. The Garand proved that victory came not only from invention, but from the ability to mass-produce perfection. When the U.S. military transitioned to the M14 rifle in the 1950s, its lineage was unmistakable. The M1's gas-operated system, rotating bolt, and semi-automatic reliability remained at its heart. The Garand's DNA lived on in rifles carried by NATO soldiers during the Cold War, across Korea, in Vietnam, and throughout Europe's divided frontiers. It had become the foundation upon which modern infantry combat was built. Meanwhile, Japan's recovery accelerated. Many of the same engineers who once analyzed the Garand moved into new industries: automotive, optics, precision machinery. They applied the same obsessive standards of tolerances and mechanisms they had once used to dissect weapons of war. In factories that would later produce Nikon cameras and Toyota engines, the ghosts of wartime laboratories whispered through the hum of peacetime innovation. The lessons of the Garand, modular design, reliable mechanics, perfect repeatability, became the backbone of Japan's technological renaissance. By the late 1950s, when Japan's self-defense forces were established, the new Hoa Type 64 rifle reflected both worlds. It drew upon American design principles but carried the subtle signature of Japanese engineering refinement: efficient, elegant, balanced. In a quiet way, the examination of that one captured weapon decades earlier had shaped a nation's approach to precision itself. For the Americans, the Garand became a relic of a golden age, a symbol of a time when craftsmanship and industrial might walked hand in hand. Museums displayed it behind glass, and veterans kept theirs polished like sacred relics of victory. Its distinctive ping, the metallic note of the en-bloc clip ejecting, became one of the most recognizable sounds of the 20th century battlefield. And for Japanese historians, that sound carried a different echo. It spoke of a moment when the old world ended, when sword, spirit, and courage were no longer enough against the rhythm of mass production and mechanized warfare. The Garand had been more than a weapon. It was a teacher. It revealed what Japan lacked, and what it would later master: precision through process, strength through system, and power through progress. Across oceans and generations, the rifle's influence endured. It bridged enemies and reshaped philosophies. What began as an artifact of defeat became, indirectly, a foundation for rebirth, an unlikely link between destruction and creation. As the last veterans of that war faded into memory, the Garand's story remained etched in steel in history and in the lessons it left behind. In the quiet halls of modern museums, the M1 Garand rests beneath soft light, silent, unassuming, its wooden stock worn smooth by the hands of men long gone. Visitors pass by, unaware that this simple rifle once carried the weight of an empire's downfall and another's awakening. It is not merely a weapon now, but a mirror of human evolution, a reminder of how understanding, once born of war, can outlive destruction itself. For Japan, the Garand marked the moment when faith and spirit met the reality of science. It shattered the illusion that courage alone could overcome precision. And yet that realization, painful as it was, became the seed of something greater. From the same factories that once forged bayonets came engines, cameras, and machines that would later astonish the world. The pursuit of mastery never vanished. It simply changed its form. For America, the rifle embodied the height of industrial ingenuity, a triumph of design that reflected the nation's unity and mechanical will. Each Garand was identical, each flawless, each proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship not only in numbers, but in quality. It turned the chaos of war into the rhythm of engineering. In the end, the story of the M1 Garand is not about who wielded it, but who learned from it. It bridged the divide between two worlds, one ending, one beginning, and revealed a universal truth. Progress is born not in comfort, but in confrontation with one's own limits. The rifle that once echoed across the Pacific now stands silent, its message undimmed by time. It reminds us that even in war's darkest hour, human hands continue to build, to refine, to seek perfection, and in that pursuit lies the quiet power that shapes history. Not through destruction, but through understanding.